Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to class on a federal holiday today. I was bummed that they didn't cancel school, but this is the way it goes this year. We're going to finish up Chapter 6 today. If you recall, last class we were talking about price controls, and the reason we're talking about price controls is because Chapter 6 is considering different ways the government might intervene in a market. So what we're going to do today is we're going to finish off with kind of the last kind of segment of how government might intervene, and it's by imposing a tax. So just so you have some organization, this is Chapter 6, Part 2, and we're going to be talking today about taxes. Okay, so first of all, why might a government want to impose a tax? There's basically two reasons. Reason number one is taxes are how governments get their revenue. So if they want to fix a street, they need money to do it. So the way they get the money is they tax their constituents. So number one is just like it's a money generating process. Number two, for a reason why a government might impose a tax on some kind of market, is because like price controls, taxes kind of manipulate the equilibrium in the market. So this is a mechanism that a government has at its disposal to kind of play with the price and the quantity that's in the market. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you two different kind of scenarios, and we're going to go through kind of the steps of what would happen in each scenario if a tax is imposed in that way. And then I'm going to do kind of a whole bunch of practice for you today so you can see how this works. So the first option of a thing that the government can do is a government could impose a tax on sellers. So we'll call this kind of Part A. So let's consider a tax on sellers. Okay, sellers again are the suppliers in a market. So let's just kind of conceptually think about what a seller would do if a government imposed a tax on them. Well, if you are Publix and the federal government comes in and they say, we're going to impose a 10-cent tax on every bottle of Coca-Cola that you sell, Publix. Well, what would Publix do? Well, Publix is the one that's being taxed. They're the seller, so they're the one that's going to have to write the check to the government. And for every bottle of Coca-Cola they sell, they're going to have to write a check for 10 cents. So they're just going to take the sticker price underneath the Coca-Cola display, and whatever the current price is going to just make it 10 cents higher. So they're going to raise the price. They're going to raise the sticker price by the amount of the tax, so that when they get that whole amount from the customer, they can just take off the 10 cents that the government is asking them for, give it to the government, and then keep their remaining amount. So kind of conceptually, before I show you how this affects the graph, let's just write out in words what this does. So what's going to happen is for each unit, a seller will increase the sticker price by the amount of the tax. Okay, so now let's kind of go back to our picture of supply and demand and think about how this would start affecting things. So if you are the seller, then this tax is going to affect you. So we need to be thinking about the supply curve. And if for every unit that you sell, you just increase the sticker price by the amount of the tax, well, then that means you're effectively just going to take each unit, so 1, 2, 3, all the way out to however many you're selling. And if the price is originally $1, well, you're going to raise it up to $1.10. And then here, you're going to raise it up by 10 cents. You're going to raise it up by 10 cents. You're going to raise it up by 10 cents. So this would cause the whole supply curve to basically just kind of move straight up. And what's important that you note here is that the amount that it's moving up by is equivalent to the amount of the tax. So if the tax had been 25 cents per bottle of Coca-Cola, then the supply curve would have moved up more. If it's only 1 cent per bottle of Coca-Cola, then the supply curve moves up just a tiny bit. So you take whatever the actual dollar amount is the tax, and you just take the supply curve and notch it up that many dollars. Okay, let's think about what happens now. So originally, we had this equilibrium quantity in the market that corresponded to this equilibrium price. But now, under the tax, we've moved the crosshairs up here. So what has happened? Well, the quantity under the tax, I'm going to call this QT, is now lower, and the final equilibrium market price, PT, is higher. Okay, so let's just kind of start writing out the results. I'll do this in red. So the results are that, first of all, the market price increases, equilibrium market price increases, equilibrium market quantity decreases. And now I'm going to introduce something called tax incidence. Okay, this is kind of mental gymnastics here. So the idea of a tax incidence is sometimes, or always, one side of the market will be actually taxed by the government, but what's not going to be true is that that side of the market necessarily bears the brunt of the tax burden. So tax incidence, and this is important, so if you don't know this or if you haven't read your textbook, kind of write this, scribble this down as I'm saying it. Tax incidence is the extent to which the tax burden is shared between the buyers and the sellers. Okay, let me say that one more time. Tax incidence is the extent to which the tax burdens are shared between the buyers and the sellers. So let me draw you kind of the picture of how this works, or add to the existing picture. The idea is, let's kind of think about, I won't draw here, but I'll just point, this little segment right here. So the distance between here and here. Okay, first of all, note that's equivalent to the amount of the tax because the curve just moved up by the amount of the tax. Okay, there is a newer equilibrium price that's higher than it was originally, but note that the difference between the original equilibrium price and the new equilibrium price, it's smaller than the tax amount, right? So the equilibrium price went up, but it didn't go up by the amount of the tax. The whole curve moved up by the amount of the tax, but the equilibrium change was smaller than the tax amount. Okay, let's kind of pick this apart. So what this means is if you are a consumer, then the amount that you're kind of hurt by the tax, or the amount that your effective price goes up, is the difference between this original equilibrium price that you're paying and the new equilibrium price that you're paying. So this leg of the tax is going to be the consumer's tax burden. Okay, there's another little leg underneath this red line that is left over. So you have the whole vertical distance between these two lines is equal to the tax. A portion of that distance is the consumer tax burden. The leftover portion is going to be the producer's tax burden. So let me, I'll draw and then I'll explain. So what we're going to do is you're going to still anchor yourself at this QT level. The spread between the two equilibriums is the consumer tax burden. The remaining difference here, that amount is going to be equal to the producer's tax burden. Okay, note that the consumer tax burden plus the producer's tax burden has to equal the tax in total. So if you add up the distances of these two little legs, you get the whole tax. Okay, the intuition for why this is the producer's tax burden. The idea is, I'm Publix. So originally I was selling each bottle of Coca-Cola for P. Now I'm selling it for higher, but after the market kind of shakes, the new equilibrium sticker price, the new equilibrium price is going to be PT. So Publix used to be bringing in P dollars per bottle. Now they're bringing in PT dollars per bottle. So they're making more. But they're the ones that have to write the check to the government. So they're going to take this excess kind of amount they're getting per bottle, but then they're going to have to subtract from that the whole amount of the tax. So if they kind of increase their intake per unit by this much, but then they have to like subtract out of that the amount of the tax, and the leftover little portion, the green leg, is the producer's tax burden. Okay, if you didn't get this quite yet, I'm going to do this several more times, so just hang with me, and in one of these iterations, hopefully this will start to click. Okay, so this is what happens if the government taxes, well actually, let me write one more thing here. So what we know is that the price went up, the equilibrium price went up, the equilibrium quantity went up, down. What we also know is that consumers are worse off because they have to pay more per bottle of Coca-Cola now, and producers are also worse off. And the reason they're worse off is because although the equilibrium price has increased, the increase in the equilibrium price isn't large enough to offset the extra amount of money that they have to pay in taxes. So this little green leg is like the amount of money per bottle of Coca-Cola that they're now losing because of the tax. Okay, so this is the scenario when the tax is levied on sellers. Now let's think about what would happen if the tax was levied on demanders in the market or consumers. Just as a note, in case you're like thinking really deeply about this, all the examples I'm giving you are examples of commodity taxes. So a commodity tax is like a fixed tax amount that's applied per unit. It's not like a 6.2% tax, because that would not be a fixed dollar amount. That's like tax that like grows proportionally with the amount of the base. So commodity taxes are just like a pegged number, and you consistently apply that number, that tax amount to each product. Okay, so B is going to be a tax on buyers. Okay, now let's think about, again, just conceptually kind of how this would work. So if I am, okay, let's think about the market for cars. So if I'm shopping for a car, and the government levies a tax on me, and they say consumers of cars, anytime you buy a brand new car, you have to pay a tax of $100. Well, how does a consumer respond? They just say, okay, well, I used to be willing to pay like $20,000 for a car. Now I'm going to be willing to pay $19,900 for a car, because on top of that, I'm also going to have to pay $100 for tax. So that kind of gets me back up to my original willingness to pay. So, for any given quantity or car level, buyers will be willing to pay T, so this is the tax amount, less than they were before. Okay, so now the picture to go with this. So we've got a demand, we've got a supply, and now the government has come in and they say, okay, anytime there's an exchange in the car market, a buyer is going to have to write us a check for $100 or whatever the tax amount is. Okay, so again, the buyers say, okay, well, this curve traces out my willingness to pay different prices for different quantities. Now, on top of whatever price I'm paying, I'm also going to have to pay a tax. So I'm just going to take my willingness to pay and just lower it by exactly the amount of the tax. And then this is going to be my new demand, given that I'm being taxed. Okay, again, this should make sense, because the idea is, suppose originally, if the price was this amount, consumers were willing to buy this many units. Well, now, if they want to still get this many units, the price is going to have to be T dollars less than it originally was, because they're going to, again, have to write a check to the government for T dollars. Okay, so we can just kind of start out making notes of what we've determined this will lead to. So first of all, originally we were at this equilibrium. Consumers are then taxed, so we move to this equilibrium. So what happens? Well, in this scenario, the price goes down, and the equilibrium price goes down, and the equilibrium quantity also goes down. Okay, let's think about the tax burdens, though, or the tax incidence, like which side of the market kind of bears the brunt of the tax. Well, okay, let's start with consumers. So consumers, okay, I'm going to label things here. So this is the original price, this is the price after the tax, and then this whole distance right here is equivalent to the amount of the tax. Because again, you're moving the demand curve down by the amount of tax, so this whole leg is equal to the tax amount. Okay, so now let's think about the consumers again. So I'm shopping for a car. Before the tax, I was in equilibrium paying this much per car. This is the equilibrium price in the market. After the tax, the equilibrium price in the market falls. So it's falling by this much relative to this much. Okay, note that the equilibrium price in the market doesn't fall by the whole tax amount. It falls, but by less than the tax. Okay, on the surface, it seems like it's great for consumers because I'm shopping around for a car. It used to be that cars were going at this rate. Now they're going at less than this. But the catch is that if I buy a car at this new PT price, I'm still on the hook for the tax. So while I kind of pick up this much in terms of paying a lower price, after I get the car at this price level, I'm going to have to pay the whole amount of the tax to the government. So we're going to say this is the sticker price, and then because I have to pay the tax, the dollars that I'm on the hook for are going to be T dollars higher than this, so I'm really on the hook for this many dollars. So if this was the original price and now I'm on the hook for this many dollars, then this upper leg here is going to be the consumer's tax burden. Okay, now let's think about the sellers of cars. So for sellers of cars, it's a little bit easier to figure out their tax burden because they're not technically on the hook for the tax, like they're not the one writing the check. So for the car dealers, originally they were bringing in this many dollars per car, P. Now they're bringing in less money per car. So they're losing per car this amount of money. So this is going to be producer's tax burden. And so these two little legs, when you add them together, the summation of those two things needs to be exactly equal to the amount of the tax. But the reason I point this out is because this demonstrates that even when the government imposes a tax on one side of the market, it's both sides of the market that are hurt. So, first of all, consumers are worse off. They're hurt. Why are they worse off? Because now they have to pay this much more per unit than they originally did. And then furthermore, producers are worse off because they're bringing in this much less per unit relative to their original kind of situation. So consumers are worse off and producers are worse off. Okay, there are two kind of cool features of taxes. Cool in the sense that, like, mathematically you kind of have to scratch your head about it. But I'm just going to kind of put up on the board, and then I'm going to give you an example and demonstrate to you that they're true. So these are just going to be, I'm going to call them notes, tax notes. Okay, so to understand the first note, kind of think back to when we were talking about elasticities. So elasticity was our way of measuring how responsive either quantity supplied or quantity demanded is to a change in some other thing. So let's think about price elasticities. So that's going to mean how responsive quantities are to changes in the price. Okay, the reason I note that is because, maybe flip the page. The reason I note that is because the first kind of feature of taxes, we'll call it feature 1, is that the tax burden in a market is going to depend on relative elasticities. So we're going to put this in our notes and then I'll explain. So tax burdens depend on relative elasticities. Okay, and then underneath this, I'm going to put kind of the specific relationship. So the side of the market that has a more inelastic response is going to be the side of the market that bears the majority of the tax burden. So the side of the market with the more inelastic, so again, they're not super responsive, supply or demand, whichever side of the market you're looking at, bears the majority of the tax burden. Okay, so let's just kind of quickly think about what we're talking about here. So suppose you have a demand curve like that. This is a very, very elastic demand curve. It's pretty flat. And then if you have a supply curve like this is a very inelastic supply because it's very steep. So it's inelastic in the sense that you can move the price a lot and you don't get much wiggle in the quantity supply. Okay, what we have said is that whichever side of the market, supply or demand, is more inelastic, when you impose a tax on this market, that side of the market that's more inelastic is going to be the one that's going to have a bigger tax burden than the other. So in this case, suppliers, the supply side is more inelastic, so that would mean if you impose a tax on this market, suppliers are going to have a bigger burden. Okay, this will make more sense when I give you a firm example, but for now that's kind of the feature. Feature number 2 is that it is entirely inconsequential which side of the market you impose a tax on, because the tax burdens will be the same no matter if the government says, okay, suppliers, we're going to impose a tax on you, or demanders, we're going to impose a tax on you. So feature 2 is that taxes imposed on suppliers are equivalent to taxes imposed on buyers. And what do I mean by equivalent? They're equivalent in the sense that the tax burdens will be identical. So I'll put ... in the sense that the tax burdens will be identical. Okay, so I'll draw 2 little pictures here. Suppose you've got a market, you got another market, and suppose the government, first of all, they decide, you know what, we're just going to tax suppliers, and the suppliers just raise their sticker prices by the amount of the tax, and this is what happens. Okay, what this says is that the way this will lead to different tax burdens, the tax burdens it leads to will be equivalent to the tax burdens that would be realized if the government had instead decided we're going to tax demanders, and the demand or the willingness to pay just shifts down by the amount of tax. So feature 2 is no matter if you're on this boat or this boat, the relative kind of brunt of the tax that one side of the market has to bear will be the same between these two scenarios. So in other words, this scenario doesn't hurt suppliers any more than this scenario hurts suppliers. Similarly, this scenario doesn't hurt buyers or consumers any more than this scenario hurts consumers. Okay, now I'm going to give you kind of a long example so that you can get practice working through the math, and I can kind of prove by demonstration that all the features I've been telling you here actually hold. Okay, so I'll erase real well. Okay, so this is the example. So consider the following market. Suppose you have a market where the supply is characterized by the following equation. Price equals quantity, and the demand is characterized by the equation price equals negative 2Q plus 12. Okay, first of all, with these equations, you can use the slope-intercept form that we've covered previously, and you can actually plot out what the supply and the demand curve look like. So let's do that over here. So try to draw this as to scale as I can. Okay, first of all, supply. So recall slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Okay, this is the vertical axis, the y, this is the horizontal axis, the x. So the coefficient in front of this should tell us the slope of the supply. Implicitly, there's a coefficient of 1, so this means the slope is positive 1. The number out here tells us the intercept of the supply curve. Implicitly, there's a plus 0. So that means we're going to start at 0, and we're going to have a slope of 1. So we're going to go up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, and you're going to get a 45-degree line, and that's going to be the supply. Okay, in the demand side, the intercept along the vertical axis is going to be 12, and the slope of the demand line is negative 2, so it's going to be twice as steep, and it's going to be negative. So it's going to be like you go down 2 over 1, down 2 over 1, and you're eventually going to get to 6 when you do this. And this is going to be the demand. Okay, question number 1 is what is the equilibrium price? Well, equilibrium is where supply and demand intersect, so you can just take these two equations and set them equal to each other. So if you set this equal to this, you're going to get Q equals negative 2Q plus 12. This gives you 3Q equals 12, Q equals 4, so we now have that number. So we can take this Q equals 4, we can plug it into either one of these equations, and that will give us the price. So if you plug 4 in here, you get the price equals 4. Alternatively, you could put a 4 in here. This will give you negative 8 plus 12, that would be 4 as well. Okay, so we've solved for equilibrium price. Okay, suppose there is a $3 commodity tax that is imposed on producers. Okay, first of all, let's think about just like how the graph will characteristically change. So if suppliers or producers are taxed at a level of $3 per unit, that means that they're just going to take this sticker price and they're just going to up it by $3 and then see how the market kind of shakes out. So if you take this curve and you vertically move it up 3 units, you're not changing the slope, so that one stays the same. But if you're moving it up by 3 units, then the intercept does move up by 3. And so the 0 out here needs to have a 3 added to it. So what you'll get is that the new supply under the tax is going to be equal to the price equals the quantity, again the slope didn't change, plus 3. And the demand doesn't change, so the demand is still price equals negative 2Q plus 12. Okay, so let's first of all draw in the new supply. So the new supply is you go up 3 units, and you get the supply under the tax. So note again, we're just moving the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. And this new red line corresponds to this equation. Okay, so we got a $3 tax on producers. The kind of question now is going to be, what is the new equilibrium price with the tax? Well, to figure this out, we do the same thing. We take the supply and demand and set them equal to each other. So now we have this new supply, an old demand. We can set these two equations equal to each other and solve for equilibrium price with the tax. So we'll now have Q plus 3 equals negative 2Q plus 12. You move things over, you'll get 3Q equals 9, implying Q equals 3. So now we know that's 3. And if you take this 3 and you plug it into either this equation or this equation, it will give you the same P. So if you plug in 3 here, then you get the price equals 6. If you plug in a 3 here, it'll be negative 6 plus positive 12, that'll be 6 again. So the price equals 6. And so the new equilibrium price of the tax is 6. Okay, now let's think about the tax burdens. Okay, so question 3 is, what are the tax burdens? Okay, let's start with the consumers. They're a little bit easier to think about. Okay, so for the consumers, we'll put the consumer burden. For the consumers, recall they're not the ones who have to write the check to the government for the tax. So all the consumers care about, since they're not like actually explicitly paying the tax, is the difference between the new and the old equilibrium prices. So the consumer burden, so to calculate the consumer burden, you think about it this way. The price goes up from $4 to $6, so they are going to lose $2 per unit. So this is their this is their tax burden. Okay, for the producer burden, think about the sellers. So they're the ones who actually have to write the check to the government. So for each unit they sell, they get $2 more. So this is consistent with the equilibrium price going up from 4 to 6. But they then have to pay the government $3 in the tax. So, okay, so think about this now. So they get $2 more for each unit that they sell, but then they have to pay the government $3 per unit. So in total, they lose $1 per unit. This is the producer's tax burden. Okay, there are two important things to note about this. I'm going to write this little wedge here, but you can write it bigger down on your piece of paper. Thing to note, star number one, is that the summation of the two tax burdens is equivalent to the totality of the tax. So again, the whole tax was $3, but the tax was effectively kind of shared between the two sides of the market. So two of the dollars were kind of felt by the consumers. One of the dollars was kind of felt by the producers. So I'm going to put the sum of the tax burdens equaled the tax. So in other words, 2 plus 1 equals 3. Okay, the second thing to note, so second star, is that we had a feature that said whichever side of the market has a more inelastic curve is going to be the side of the market that has the bigger tax burden. Okay, let's just look at the picture and think about which side of the market is more inelastic. Well, the demand curve is steeper. It had a slope of -2, whereas the supply curve had a slope of 1. So in this market, the demand is more inelastic because it's steeper. So the feature said because the demand is relatively more inelastic than the supply, the consumer should have a bigger tax burden. Okay, check. So the consumer tax burden is 2, whereas the producer tax burden is only 1. So this kind of is a demonstration that feature holds. So the star is that the more inelastic side of the market, which in this case was the demanders, has a bigger tax burden. Okay, so the last little thing we're going to do here is let's erase some stuff. So we're going to keep a part of this question so we don't have to start from scratch. So erase if you have in your piece of paper a new supply curve, erase that, or redraw a new graph without a new supply curve. Go back to the original equilibrium. And, all right, can't erase and talk at the same time. Okay, let's just flip the script so that instead of having the tax on producers, it's on consumers. So what we've got for this next kind of part is we're going to have the same original supply and demand. Question 1 prime is what is the equilibrium price in this market? Well, we already solved for it. It's $4. Okay, question number 2 now, call this 2 prime, is let's assume that there's now a $3 tax on consumers. And now let's calculate the equilibrium price in the market. Okay, again, think very descriptively about what's going to happen. So now every time someone buys a thing, they have to pay a certain amount of money in a tax for it. So this is going to affect the demanders. The demanders are going to say, these are the prices I'm comfortable with. Well, now if I'm going to have to pay a tax, I'm just going to kind of lower the amount that I'm comfortable with by exactly the amount of the tax, because on top of the price I pay, I'm going to have to pay the tax. So the whole demand curve is going to just drop by the amount of the tax. Okay, now let's think about how the equations need to get updated. So if you just take this demand curve and you just drop it by the amount of the tax, well, the slope hasn't changed, so this -2 won't budge. But the intercept has gone down by the amount of the tax. So if the tax is $3 again, then what used to be an intercept at 12 is now going to be, the tax equals 3, If this goes down by 3, the new intercept is going to be 3 units lower than 12, which is 9. So we can write out new equations. So, what is this? So the supply doesn't change. So the supply is still going to be P equals Q, but now the demand under the tax is going to be, the price is going to equal negative 2Q, and then I'll put plus 12, and then you go down by 3. So in total, the new intercept is 9. Okay, so to calculate the new equilibrium price, which is going to be down here, you simply set the supply and demand equal to each other. So you're going to have Q equals negative 2Q plus 9. If you rearrange terms, you get 3Q plus 9 equals 9. And this gives you Q equals 3. So you got that. Then again, you can take this 3 and you can plug it into either one of these equations and it will give you the price. So if you plug a 3 in here, that tells you the price is 3. Alternatively, you could plug a 3 in here. This will give you negative 6 plus 9, which again is 3. So this is going to be the new equilibrium price under the tax. Okay, the last question, 3 prime, is what are, I'm going to erase this so I can have space right this time. So 3 prime is what are the tax burdens? Okay. So 3 prime, what are the tax burdens? Okay, let's begin by thinking of the consumers. Okay, so consumers, you're out at the store. Before the tax, you used to pay $4 per item. Now you're going to have to pay $3 per item. So the consumer burden, first of all, it's going to have to incorporate the fact that they're actually paying less at the register. The pre-tax amount is actually less than it was before. So for consumer burden, we have to take into account for each unit, they get to keep, put quotes around this, keep an extra $1. This is kind of because the equilibrium price moves from 4 to 3. But they have to give up $3 to pay the tax. So $3 to the government to pay the tax. So in total, they're going to lose $2 per unit. This is the consumer tax burden. So again, the equilibrium price lowers, so they get to keep an extra $1, but then on top of the price they pay, they have to pay $3 in taxes. So you keep an extra $1 here, you give up $3 extra here, and total you're losing $2. Okay, the producer burden is a little bit simpler because the producers, they're not writing the check to the government for the tax, so all that they care about is the equilibrium price. So for each unit, they get a $1 lower price. So for each unit, they bring in a $1 lower price. So they're going to lose $1 per unit. This is the producer tax burden. Okay, now I'm gonna, for the very last thing, I'm gonna give you 2 more star things or notable things for you to kind of recognize, and then I'll let you practice on your own after the break. So, thing to note 1 is that the burdens here are the same as before. So when the tax was simply levied on the other side of the market, The consumer still had a $2 tax burden. The producer still had a $1 tax burden. So this is one of the features. We said it doesn't matter whether you take the tax and you slap it on the buyers or on the sellers. The tax burdens will be the same in either situation. So the tax burdens are the same as before. I'll put in parentheses when the tax was imposed on the other side of the market. And the second thing to note is something that I've already noted in the previous example. But again, just recognize here that the side of the market that had the more inelastic response was the side that had the bigger burden. So because we didn't change kind of the structure of the supply and the demand, we just changed kind of like, we just moved it up and down. The demand in this situation is still, the demand is still more inelastic. And so since it's still more inelastic than the supply, what we still get is that they have the bigger burden. So really the takeaway here is that when we're thinking about a government slapping a tax on a market, sometimes it's politically convenient to like say that you're going to tax one side of the market. Sometimes it's politically convenient to say, oh, we're going to impose the tax on big corporations. Whether you impose the tax on a big corporation or on the people who actually buy the product from the big corporation is entirely irrelevant. Sometimes it sounds nicer to do it one way or the other, but at the end of the day, the only thing that matters in terms of kind of who feels the burden of the tax is which side of that particular market is more inelastic. If the consumers in a particular market have a more inelastic response, then even if the tax is slapped on the corporation, the consumers are going to bear the majority of the burden. So last star is that still the more inelastic side paid, isn't quite right, bore the majority of the burden. Okay, sorry, apologies for the extra long class today. This is the end of the chapter, so I kind of had to just push through it. So during the next 10 minutes, definitely look over this so you kind of just let it sink in a little bit, and then after the 10-minute break, I'm going to give you a similar example to this so you can just practice working through it on your own. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know, and then I'll see you after 10 minutes. Okay, for the exercise today, we have some camera problems here. Suppose that you have a supply and demand that are characterized by the following two equations. Both of these equations are in slope-intercept form. So this is the slope of the demand equation, this is the intercept, this is the slope of supply curve, this is the intercept. Kind of pre-exercise exercise is plot these two things. And then the real questions are, first of all, suppose the government imposes a $12 commodity tax on producers. Commodity tax is just the same kind of tax that we've been looking at. It's just like a fixed amount per unit. The initial question you need to answer is, what is the consumer tax burden under this situation? And then second of all, what is the producer tax burden under this situation? Question number 2 is, now suppose government just flips the script and they take this $12 commodity tax and they just slap it on the other side of the market on the consumers. The first thing you need to answer or calculate is, what is the consumer tax burden now, and then what is the producer tax burden now, given that the tax is on consumers. 3 things you can kind of use to spot check yourself as you're going through the math. First of all, what we learned was that whichever side of the market has the more inelastic response to the price, that's the side of the market that bears the majority of the tax. So note which one of these 2 things is more inelastic, and that will tell you whether A or B should be bigger. The second thing is that we said it doesn't really matter whether the government slaps the tax on producers or consumers, the burdens are the same. So when you go through the math, verify that your answers to 1 are matching your answers to 2. And then number 3, third thing you use to kind of spot check yourself is note that the consumer tax burden plus the producer tax burden has to add up to the tax. So your answer to A plus your answer to B should be equal to 12. I know this is kind of a lot of work to get through in the next few minutes, so do your best to go through it all. If you get to the end of class and you haven't finished all of it, just submit what you have done and then finish it on your own time. That way you'll get your participation points, but you can still make sure you're understanding the material for the exam. Last thing before I let you go is we are done with Chapter 6 now, so for next class, make sure that on your own time you read Chapter 7. This way you'll be up to speed for the next lecture. And of course, if you have a question about anything, feel free to reach out. So good luck on the exercise and enjoy the rest of your day.